Hi, guys. I'm so excited that I get to introduce Mona. So, if you read her bio before you came, you can tell that she knows her stuff. I have this reoccurring anxiety dream where I show up to college unprepared and I've missed class all semester and then I have to take the exam. So with that in mind, let me read you what Mona has done. A BA in Political Science and Sociology from NYU, a master's in education degree from Bank Street College in New York City, a master's in social work from Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College in New York City, and a PhD in special education and clinical science from the University of Oregon. So I'm tired and out of breath just from reading it. But she knows her stuff. But here's the thing about Mona. She's smart, but she's in the thick of it. She is actively walking with people that are marginalized and forgotten and unnoticed. And so she is doing the work and has been there, has seen pain, experienced pain, and God is using this knowledge that she has to spread his love and his word on topics that are, we don't want to talk about that, and it's really uncomfortable, and we don't want to bring that up, but he's using her as his vehicle to change hearts. And that's what I love about knowing her. I first got to meet her. We actually had a mutual young mom friend who we got to work together to kind of build her up and help her think through housing and caring for her child. And then I got to attend a forum class that she teaches on poverty and race with a group of women at a ministry called Young Lives in Nashville. It's a teen mom ministry. She's now on their board. But she came to a room full of predominantly white women and basically kind of in the most loving way said, here's what you guys need to know to be better, to love better. And so I just am excited for you to see her gift. And yeah, it's going to be great. So, Dr. Mona Ivey-Soto.
Thank you, friend. I think I am good.
Thanks.
I am so excited to be here. I mean, I've just been waiting for this all week, and my daughter had Winter Olympics at school today, and she said, Mom, I just can't get sick by Wednesday, any day after that. And I said, me too. I don't want to get sick by Wednesday. I want to be able to be here for all my friends tonight. So I am so excited to join you here. This church is right next to my neighborhood. I feel a lot of love every time I drive by. When we first moved here from New York, it was the first Wonder Week that my kids came to, and we were like, this is pretty phenomenal. So I have felt welcomed and loved since I've been here 4.5 years ago. So thank you so much for coming tonight to embark on just the beginning, really, of a conversation, a dialogue, some learning together, collaborative learning. And I pray that this sparks in your heart and in your soul a deeper longing to continue the journey, start the journey. I don't know where everybody's at in terms of understanding the history of race and racism in our country, how it's intersected with our faith, what that means in terms of carrying out the work of justice in our community and in our world. But wherever you're at in that journey, I pray that this will just continue to plant a seed or continue to grow a seed that's already been planted, and you'll just be further burdened to kind of continue doing this work, right? Whenever I give talks like this, I teach whole classes on it for whole semesters, and it's not nearly enough time even in a semester. So 45 minutes is really just skimming the surface. So I'd love to come back or keep talking to you or share resources with you to kind of continue the journey, but we will try to do as best as we can tonight. And one of the things that I say when we have kind of short times to learn together is to expect and accept non-closure. Right? So sometimes when we go to workshops or trainings or even when we come to church on Sunday mornings, we want everything wrapped up in a neat bow when we leave and everything kind of fixed. And that's just not how this work is. That's not the life work of racial justice. Jesus left us with all of this work to be done, right? And he had work to do, and he did all this work. So that continuous command of leaning in and continuing on it is just something I hope to impart tonight as we move forward. Let's see. Hold on. It's coming. It's coming. There we go. So when I first started at my church, Strong Tower, our pastor has said these statements over a couple different sermons at different times, and they really stood out to me because many of us grew up in families or in faith communities or just in communities in general where we were kind of taught to silence things that were uncomfortable, right? You don't talk about religion or politics at the dinner table. Instead of, again, thinking, how can I lean in and learn the skills to begin to peel the onion back, have a conversation, develop some skills, some knowledge, some content awareness about these different issues so that I can engage in these difficult but necessary conversations. So I like to lead with those ideas of we can't heal what we don't reveal. We can't address what we don't confess. So maybe this is a time for us tonight to turn inward and to reflect on what are the things that I need to confess around the ways that maybe I haven't understood my neighbors and communities who have been marginalized. What are things that I need to maybe publicly ask for forgiveness for or just in my heart really work towards revealing, right? How could this be a sense of revealing for me? So this timeline, if you haven't seen it, it's out there a lot on social media, but I just want you to look at it for a minute and look at the span of years that in the United States we have lived in an unjust, racist society, right? 346 years if you just look at from American slavery through segregation. Like we're not even talking about the current manifestations of inequality in all of our systems, right? I would love to come back and tell you all the ways that we see injustice in our education, in our healthcare, in our housing, in our employment, in our criminal justice, on and on. But even if we're not even looking at that, we look at the centuries of racial inequality. And yet, my 18-year-old college students are like, Dr. Ivey-Soto, you've talked about this stuff for too long. And I'm like, we can't have long enough. Look how many years, right, that this has been going on, that it hasn't been spoken about, that it has been revealed. Right, we can take some time to sit in this, right? We can lament about it. We can find sorrow in it and then move from awareness to action, right? Move towards what does this information do? What is it stirring in my soul to act upon, right? What are the ways that I see the injustice displayed on this timeline historically and currently still at work in my own city? It's everywhere. In my own city of Franklin, right? It's everywhere. If you begin to put on that lens, and we talk about in the Bible, we talk about pulling back the curtain. When the curtain's been pulled back, you start to see it everywhere you go, and you notice it, and you're burdened by it. Your heart is breaking over it. And some of you have had that experience. Maybe it's about issues of racism. Maybe it's other forms of oppression and marginalization, things that give you a holy discontent, that stir, that keep you up at night. Right? I feel like this is an issue that Jesus cared a lot about. So if he cared a lot about it, what are we doing? How is it working and moving in us and moving us towards doing something about it? So probably all of you have seen these things on social media or some version of these statements, right? I've seen them quite recently. And they are true, right? They kind of make us feel good. It's like the rendition after there's been something horrible that's happened, either internationally or in our country, and we see the picture of the young African-American boy hugging a police officer, and we post it and we say, see, we're more alike than we are different. And that is true, right? If we look at how race is a social construct, that is true. Our DNA is not that different. But sometimes I worry that these statements and others like it erase the inequality that's behind it, right? So yes, we are alike, and as followers of Christ, that's a unique way that we are knit together. There's no doubt. But that doesn't mean that our lived experiences are the same. And Jesus cared very much about that. He didn't just say, everybody's had the same experience. There was so much indication of different lived experience, different life journeys throughout Scripture. And if we don't recognize that here today, we're not giving our neighbors the gift of justice and of love that we really, I believe all of us want to. So I'm not telling you not to post these things, but if you post them, help people understand that, yes, while no one is born racist, and while we want to all have the heart and innocence of a child, the world that we live in is filled with inequality and injustice. And so we should be burdened by the fact that we can't stay here, right? We can't just stay in a graphic or a picture or an image that is kumbaya, right? A lot of people say, well, Dr. King talked about the beloved community. Yes, he did, but we're not there yet, right? We want to be there where we, don't judge each other by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. We're not there yet. So until we are there, we have a lot of work to do, all of us, a lot of heavy lifting. So I'm going to read you a really quick story in a really wonderful book by Sarah Shin. It's called Beyond Colorblind, Redeeming Our Ethnic Journey. This is a Christian book. Sarah's a friend. She got to come to Belmont where I teach a couple years ago, and it was a wonderful time together. But she really takes us through the history of the church in terms of honoring and looking at the ways that the Bible honors racial and ethnic differences, and the way that the church and Christianity has made some wrong turns, but what we can do to redeem it. And that's the beautiful part of it, is that Jesus is redeeming us each day, giving us a chance to make it right, to make those changes, and so we have that opportunity. So listen to just this quick story about Michael. Michael, a 24-year-old black man, was sharing with his small group about some hurtful experiences with racism that he had endured in the past year. An elderly white woman tried to respond to his sharing with grandmotherly kindness. Oh, Michael, when I see you, I see you. I don't see your color. Michael didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. But internally he thought, I'm a black man from Los Angeles. If you don't see my color, you might as well not see me at all. Using the paradigm of color blindness, the woman was trying best to affirm Michael's humanity and dignity. She was trying to say, I'm not one of those racist people who thought color was a reason to degrade you. But what Michael heard was invalidation. I don't see you. Why did they miss each other, right? What happened there? Intent versus impact, right? Her intent was to say, I don't see color, meaning I don't use your color as a way to judge you. But he's saying, I'm a black man who's had really difficult things happen to me in my life as a result of racism, right? And when you don't see me, you're not acknowledging all the stories, all the threads of my existence that have brought me to where I am today, right? So understanding that while the intention of the woman may not have been harmful, the impact felt like erasure, cultural erasure, right? And so think about times, maybe we're sitting here and we've said that, and that's okay. Again, that's where we know there's all this place for redemption, for grace, for mercy. Maybe we've said that to somebody, or I don't see your disability. I don't see your fill in the blank, right? And for some people, they might say, oh, that means you're accepting me fully for who I am. But for most people, especially when it comes to people of color, and in particular because of the history of slavery and injustice in this country, for African Americans, and I would argue for other people of color in general, saying I don't see color is a micro-invalidation of their existence, right? It's like washing them away. So again, if we've said that, it's okay. It's important to just understand what's behind that, what are people thinking and experiencing, and how can I do better? So take a minute I know it's early for discussion, but I'm just curious for you to talk a little bit at your table. Reflect for a minute on that story. Have you personally ever been in a situation where somebody said that to you? If not, think about why. And then what do you think is the responsibility of believers of Jesus in response to this? What could be a teachable moment perhaps for this woman in the small group who Michael probably has relationship with if they're in group together, so there's a chance to reconnect, to make a better choice the next time. What do you think? And maybe we'll just, I don't know, we don't really have microphones, but I know we have limited time, so maybe we won't do any small group discussion now, but what do you think? What are some options for a different way to be? What's a deeper responsibility that we all think, now that we've heard just a little bit of that story, maybe we've heard other stories similar? Yeah, acknowledge his pain, right? Show that level of empathy, that connection. If he pointed that out, right, which in the moment it sounds like he just internalized it. Maybe afterwards he did point it out, maybe not. Or maybe somebody else. And again, that's the work of once we know better, we do better. Maybe somebody else. And I put a lot of that responsibility on white people who are in the majority. Maybe you heard that. And you go over and say, hey, you know what? I know you didn't mean to harm Michael, and I know that you care deeply about him, but that comment erased a big part of who he is and how he views himself and how he walks through the world, the daily things that he experiences. What do you think about that, right? And having a discussion. Not a scolding, not a you're a bad person, the woman who said it, but just a chance for a moment of learning, right? But meeting it with empathy to Michael, and then maybe allowing for some different teaching or learning for the person who said it. So think about it, because part of what I hope from our time together is, what are we taking from this that we can do to interrupt injustice in the spheres that we walk in, right? What are times that we've heard somebody give a joke, say something, do something, ignore something that was done? How did we react? What did we say? What did we do? It's hard. There's been times where it's caught me off guard when somebody said something, and I haven't responded the way that I want to, even though I'm passionate about this stuff. This is my life. This is my work. And I'm a New Yorker, I'm loud, and I'm like, why didn't I say anything? Wow, because it wasn't, I just didn't. And so I have to give myself grace and say, okay, next time, because there will be a next time, how can I interrupt injustice when I spot it, right? That time it happened to be when I was getting my hair cut, and my hairdresser said something really racist, and I was like, well, you have scissors, so I don't know, but I could have said something after, right? Like, hey, you know what, that really impacted me, and I'm uncomfortable with that. What's going on? What's behind that, right? It doesn't have to be an attack, but just help me understand, unpack for me why that was your response. So thinking about meeting the person who's been impacted with empathy, the person who might have said something with some level of responsibility for deeper learning. There we go. Let's see. Okay, let's go back. Sorry, y'all. So let's dig in a little bit more into color blindness, colorblind ideology. There's a lot of terms for it. But it's basically what we just said about what was done to Michael, right? I don't see color, I see people. We're all one race, the human race. There are no differences. They're all, we all bleed the same, right? Yes, but again, those statements erase the lived experience of people who are experiencing racial injustice and racism on a daily basis. So again, and if you think of Michael saying, you didn't see me, when we have these statements that we hear around or have said of, I don't see color, I see people, I don't see race, I see humans, it doesn't give the fullness of our humanity, and it's certainly not the way Jesus would want us to view people, right? So colorblind, and I'm not going to read through all of this, but just as a definition, is a racist ideology that posits that the best way to end discrimination is by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. The words there that stand out is without regard to, right? And I've seen definitions that say like, respecting everybody in spite of. Well, why are we in spite of? Why aren't we like, this is who we are, celebrating because of, right? Not in spite of. So I think when we begin to think about the power of language, most of us would agree, yeah, it's because of these things that make us these beautiful creations. It's the different textures of our hair, the different hues of our skin, right? The way that our eyes balance with all these things. I mean, God took no shortcuts on all that. It's amazing. It's remarkable. Think about my kids. They love when we have an opportunity to use skin color paints and crayons, because I'm of mixed race identity. My husband's Puerto Rican. We got the whole gamut in the family, from A to Z of race of colors. But they love when they get the skin color paints and they can find the exact match. Because if you're in the middle brown, and for anybody really, those regular box of crayons, they don't do any of us justice, right? So get a box of skin color crayons if you don't have them already at home. And they have skin color paints. They have skin color paper. It's lovely. It's wonderful. But they feel so validated when they can mix colors together and say, I'm cappuccino, I'm caramel, right? It feels beautiful. You found something that matches you. So if kids notice that and they feel beauty in that, why are we denying that, right? It's how God made us. He wants us to celebrate those things. So again, as we said before, colorblindness, if we think about what the woman in the story said, on the surface it can look like, you're just being kind, it's a good thing, you're taking that idea of not judging people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That sounds all nice. But again, we're not there in society. We're in a place where there's still so many acts of racial injustice daily, not just individually, right? Because an important thing to remember about this, and again, I'd love to come back and teach all about this, is that when we talk about racism, we're not just talking about the individual acts, right? Because you can imagine at Belmont University, all my students are like, I'm not racist, I have a black friend, I have black neighbors. And I'm like, okay, you may not be actively racist, but if you are white in this country, you are benefiting from racism, right? You have a privilege that is unearned, right? That is yours, right? So you may not be carrying out acts of racism, whether that's passive or active, but you're benefiting from the fact that you're white in this country, right? And if we were to go through all of the other parts of identity, we could say that, people who have wealth benefit in ways that people who are poor don't, right? So these identity markers, there's more than just race, but to me, race is still so central, right? It's not something that we can diminish in any way in terms of the power and what it holds. So it's so important to remember that even if we ourselves aren't thinking negative thoughts about people of color or carrying out negative remarks or responding to somebody's racist tweet and going, yeah, that was a good one, we still are benefiting from a system of racism that is alive and well in our country. And some of y'all might not agree, and that's okay. I always tell my students, it's all right. You don't have to drink my Kool-Aid. Just listen, because sometimes they're like, oh, I got to think just like you to do well in this class. I said, no, I'm just going to present you with historical evidence and current evidence, and you got to make your mind up for yourself. But really look into history, right? For tomorrow, my students are watching the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay. How many of you have seen that documentary? If you haven't, please watch it. And think about, from tonight's talk, what are the ways that we see the themes from that film? And there's countless others. There's another more recent one by her called When They See Us, about the Central Park Five. What are the ways that these issues that look historical in nature still rear their ugly claws in our systems today, right? Because we can't look at any social injustice on the surface without understanding the historical underpinnings of it, right? Everything has a deeper history, and that's why if we don't address these things, they're not just going to go away. And I use the metaphor back to that first idea of we can't heal what we don't reveal. Sometimes my students are like, whatever, I grew up, we don't talk about it, it goes away. I'm like, all right, follow me on this one then. Let's take mental health, right? And I'm not comparing mental health to racism. I'm not saying they're the same thing. But if you had a family member or friend who came up to you and said, I'm really struggling with depression and anxiety, would you say to them, stop right there, I don't want to hear about it. Talking about it makes it worse. And actually, you know what, you're making it worse for yourself by telling that story. You need to just not talk about it and it will go away. That, right? Most of us were like, nah, I wouldn't do that. That sounds terrible. So why do we either consciously or unconsciously think that when it comes to talking about race or other forms of injustice, right? We want to back away because, if we talk about it, it'll make it too much of an issue, but that's not true. Talking about it heals it, right? Listening to people's stories who've experienced racism is healing for them. It allows us to step into their pain and say, how did you feel? What did it feel like to not be seen? What did it feel like to not be heard? What was it like to be denied a mortgage? What was it like to not be shown housing in certain neighborhoods? These are things that have happened in my family. Last year, my husband and I got a refund check from our car loan place because they had overcharged or charged a higher interest rate for people with Spanish last names. Last year, friends. I was real happy about that little refund check, but I was real frustrated that this was still going on, right? That happens all the time. That's a system. It's still going on. So we're very sorry, Dr. and Mr. Soto, but here's your refund check. But think about that. Millions of people impacted by that, by predatory loan practices that were directly targeting people of color. So these things are very current. Again, we don't have time to go into all the examples, but it's happening. So when we say we don't see it, we're denying all of these everyday experiences that people are having. Going out to the store, right? Being followed. I did a training at a school in Williamson County that has one black teacher. And I said, I promise you, I'm not going to call on you. I never do that with, because I'm like, I don't want you, you're not a speaker for your whole group. I will not call on you. If you want to share anything, you can. But she said in front of the group, she said she went with a colleague to like a teacher store, and they went to return something that they had gotten for their classroom. And her colleague had the bag of whatever they were returning, like they each had something to return. And her colleague walked back to the section of the store where she was going to get the replacement. And the black teacher was like, just stopped at the front. Her colleague's like, come on, we got it, let's go, let's get. She goes, I can't take that bag with me. They're going to think I'm stealing. Oh, no, they won't, right? That was an erasure. No, they won't. You're fine, you're a teacher. Nope, I've had this happen to me a couple months ago in this same store, right? So this is lived reality that person, you can imagine, her heart rate was probably going fast. I got to follow the rules, right? I might have my receipt and my item in my bag, but this is not the same experience for me, right? Going to a store, not the same reality. So when we have this colorblind ideology, we erase that reality, whether it's everyday experiences or really large things like being charged too much on a car loan or not being shown property, right? My husband, when he was looking for an apartment in New York City, of all places, wouldn't be shown certain apartments in certain neighborhoods because the real estate said, we don't think people of your kind can afford to live here, right? This was not even that long ago. So these are things that are happening. And again, the more that we get into relationship with people, the more that we hear these stories and realize that they are realities. Again, not to make us feel guilt. I tell my students, I don't want anyone walking out here with a big G, guilt. But I do want you to think about the big R, which is responsibility, right? And that's, again, as believers, we all have responsibility for things to carry out based on what we know, what the Word tells us. So it's not a feeling of, oh, I feel so bad, I'm terrible, I should not like myself because I've benefited. No, but what am I doing with that? How am I leaning into the stories and experiences of my neighbors, people of color, people of different backgrounds who have a different daily reality, and what am I doing to learn from them, to try to interrupt injustice when I see it, to look at maybe on my workplace how I'm changing practices so that we have more fair hiring practices, so that we make sure that people are getting paid the same, right? All these things that can be done to try to make our world more color conscious or colorful rather than colorblind. What's my time till? Oh, 7:30, right? Okay. Any of you seen these images online? Anybody? There's a couple more just like that. Yeah. What do you think when you see these images? Anybody just throw out an emotion or a thought? Right, it's the opposite of what's happening, right? And there's another one that's not on here, but it was a Latina in a household, and her maid is a white woman, right? And she's on the phone, ignoring, the maid's trying to. So another image that kind of jolts our sense of reality, right? What we are used to seeing. Imagine again. Let's say we live in a colorblind world, right? What does this picture say to us? Clearly we don't, because this child on the left who's looking at dolls and trying to find a doll that's a mirror to her image is not finding that. But do we walk into Target and Walmart? Do our doll racks look like that? They're a little better now than they were when I was a kid, right? But they don't look like that, right? And I always find it interesting. My kids are older now, so I don't look too much at dolls, but the few times that I would be in that section, I would notice that the brown or darker skinned dolls were on sale. And I was like, I don't know, and maybe there was nothing going on, but I was like, they're marked a lot lower. I mean, hey, great deal for me, but, maybe because they're not being bought as much, but why isn't every family stocking their kids' doll shelves with all hues, right? Research tells us that that's one of the most important ways to build empathy for boys and girls, right? Let them see differences. Don't say, oh, those differences don't exist. The dolls are all the same. Kids are going to tell you, no, they're not. That one has dark brown hair. That one has brown eyes. They're not the same, Mom and Dad, right? Kids know that. So let this image help us to see also, to think about, what do black children think when they walk into a toy store and they don't see anything that resembles them? When they go to the library or the bookstore. And they're looking for what we call in literacy research, mirror experiences, things where they can see themselves. And not just black children, but brown children and Asian children and Middle Eastern children. Where are the mirrors? There's a whole lot of windows, right, where they can see out into the world. There's a whole lot of opportunities for them to learn about everybody else. But where are the mirrors, right? And so for us, in our parenting and our interactions with kids, that's something, a point to think about, and for ourselves, is everything that we are consuming in terms of our media, the authors that we read, the movies that we watch, are they all mirror experiences? Right? Who gives us wisdom? Who speaks into our life? Faith leaders, right? Are we listening to faith leaders of color? Are we reading a book that's going to come out in May called The Brown Church by a friend of mine in LA? Awesome book about the history of brown people and the formation of the church, right? Great book. Are we yearning to pick up things like that? Or books like Beyond Colorblind, written by an Asian American woman? Hopefully we are, right? Because these are believers. If our walk in Christ is influenced by these diverse voices, we are better believers, right? So if all of our experiences are mirror experiences and not window experiences where we're seeing out into the world, we're really selling ourselves short as humans and as Christians. And through these different modes of literature is a great way for us to also go beyond what we might not be able to get in our neighborhood, right? So I live in Franklin too, and there's not a lot of people who look like my family. And so when I met Diana, I was like, thank you, Jesus. And it was like, wow, who are you and what's going on? And this is like, looks like my people, what's happening? But I don't see a lot of that. And so that's nothing wrong with that, but I'm constantly yearning for mirror experiences, right? For my kids, where do we fit? Because in the South, where the binary of black and white is very strong, brown people, where do we fit? We fit, and I go to a more black than white church, and so I definitely fit in the black community, and I feel very loved and connected and deeply rooted. But there's all these other parts of my identity then that I'm not able to fully express because people are like, where's your husband from? And where are your parents from? And where is that on the map? And so we got to get out the map and put some tax in there, the whole thing. So what are we doing to provide that for our kids? And would you say that the people in your circle understand these diverse voices and appreciate them and see them as life-giving, right? These are the things that I have to challenge myself with and that we all want to be thinking a little bit more deeply about. So I know we only have about 20 minutes to talk about how this impacts the church. Again, this is, a long thing to think about. But what are the ways that the silence, right? So a lot of people will say, well, nobody's said anything, right? But it's not just the things that we say, it's the omissions. It's the silence of well-intentioned churches, right? Faith leaders, Christians in general, because we are the church. The silence of people when things have happened, right? My father's Muslim, and so I grew up in a dual faith household. It's a whole other interesting story. But I often will have people say to me, well, why aren't Muslim leaders condemning horrific acts of terrorism? I say, well, some of the ones that I know are, but I said, and they should, but why aren't Christians condemning horrific acts of terrorism at Mother AME Church in South Carolina? How many churches were talking about that on Sunday and grieving and lamenting, right? And again, it's not to make a comparison. People say, well, this is worse. This is life lost, right? It's racial hate crimes. So are we outraged? Are we burdened by that? Where is the church in that? And if you didn't say anything after that, there's been plenty of other things that have happened that give us an opportunity and it doesn't have to be an every Sunday thing, but times when we could lean into this a little more and say, what am I missing? Why am I not burdened by this? And if I'm not burdened by it, then maybe I'm not in direct relationship with people who are experiencing this so that I can carry their burdens, right? That's the difference between sympathy and empathy, right? If you don't go home and watch a really short video by Brene Brown. It's awesome about the difference between sympathy and empathy. But sympathy is what a lot of us, and not just in this room, oh, it's so sad. Too bad. Sorry, I'll pray for you. And empathy also is, I'll pray for you, but it's tell me your story. I want to carry that. Not that I'm going to carry it because I don't know what it's like, but I want to bear that burden with you. I want to lean in. I want to ask you how you're doing next week. I want to not invalidate the fact that, oh, that person probably didn't grab their wallet because they saw a black man. They probably were just grabbing their wallet because that's what they do. No, if you told me that that's what happened to you, I want to believe you. And I'm going to say, you know what? I don't understand that because it's not something I've experienced, but I'm going to believe you. I see you. I hear you. I feel you. Let me carry that burden with you, right? What a beautiful thing. I mean, that's what the church is supposed to be. We're supposed to be a mess coming together to carry each other's messes. If we're not, then we're really not leaning into that deep and direct call of the gospel. So again, this is not to indict this church or any church, but to say we are the church. What are we all doing? How are we all carrying this a little bit more, a little bit heavier? This is also one of those, like, when you watch football games, it's John 3:16. Right, on everything. Is that the right verse, or am I saying the wrong verse? Yeah. Okay, I was like, oh gosh, I haven't watched football in a while. This is also the verse, Galatians 3:28, that people always quote to often defend colorblind ideology, right? There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. So we look at, well, Jesus erased all differences, right? Yes, he did, but also this was Paul's command not to endorse or talk about colorblindness, but to talk about erasing, and not to talk about erasing distinctions, but rather to talk about erasing disparities, right? Not that to not focus on our differences or not to honor the ways that we're different, but to look at how, because of the history and the sin of racism and other injustice in this country, how that's led to deep disparity, right? All the different ways that people live based on whether they have marginalized identities or not, right? That their world reality is different. And so when we think about that, it's a commandment not to erase differences, but to say, how do I look at erasing disparities, right? In my workplace, in my home, right? In my church community, what are the ways that maybe you're saying, well, I don't have a lot of, overt diversity where I work or where I live or where my kids go to school, but how are you helping to raise the next generation of kids who understand and are burdened by the disparities that exist, right? I can tell and I'll tell you, being a college professor, I can tell the students that come into Belmont, and this is, I could bet this would go for most places, whose parents and church community have done a good job raising this awareness. They don't come in knowing much. I don't mean that. They know some stuff. They don't come in knowing a lot about this, but their hearts are opened. They are coming up to me at the end of class like, why didn't anybody tell me about this? How did I not hear about this, right? They have this deep desire to lean in, this humility. The ones who didn't get this are tuning me out on class 2. They're texting. They're arrogant. And again, I'm talking in extremes, right? There's a whole lot in between. But there's not this humility of Jesus to say, where did I miss out? And what am I missing in my life, right? Diversity brings us so much more in our life. It enriches us. It's not just a thing to do to meet numbers and quotas. It's like I'm missing out on people's stories and understanding our country for what it really is. And yeah, being mad, but also saying, all right, I have this opportunity to change this. And I challenge them to think about every industry, because they'll be like, well, you're an educator, Dr. Ivey-Soto, so yeah, you could see these things in the schools. I'm like, are you in healthcare? It's all the way there. Are you in the music industry? It's everywhere there. There's not one industry where we can't see how racial inequality, gender inequality is not present. I don't care where you are, right? And so the job that we have of shepherding ourselves and the next generation to have this deep empathy, this desire to want to go deeper, to want to not be, mad at the world about these things, right? You can have some righteous anger, but also to say, all right, well, what am I doing with it? And not just service projects. Service projects are great, but service projects sometimes can continue inequality, because then if our kids are only seeing brown people as poor, we haven't done a very good job deconstructing that. That can sometimes further inequality, right? So we got to be careful with some of that too. So I take my kids along with me when we go into the projects, we go other places, and I introduce my friend. These are my friends, right? These are not like so-and-so that I'm helping to get a new car. This is my friend. And so now my kids are burdened for my friend who is in the projects, who's this amazing woman who turned her life around from drug addiction, and she's walking with Jesus, and she's got nothing. And my kids are like, Mom, what's up with the car? Like, why doesn't she have a car yet? What's happening? I say, yeah, go tell your friends. Let's raise money, right? But they're burdened by this because they're experiencing that. They're inhabiting these places in a way that this is not other. This is not out there, but this is where our neighbors live. This is what our neighbors are experiencing. It's all happening right here. So think about that the next time you look at Galatians 3:28 or other scriptures that people might use to erase differences or to try to get us to minimize discussions about justice. And think about really what was the intention of the words that were spoken by Jesus or, by others who were inspired to write the word, inspired by the Holy Spirit. Oh, there's a whole lot of words on this thing. I'm so sorry. Gosh, when I'm thinking about it, it always seems so much more to me, but I'm not going to go through all the words. We've got about 10 minutes, so if you want to take a picture of this slide, I'm just going to keep us moving because I want to get to some of the things, about we've talked about where we can go, what we can do next, but I really want everybody to leave here encouraged. First of all, the fact that y'all came on a Wednesday, rainy, cold night shows that you care, right? Nobody's like scanning your card at the end to give you credit for something. Yes, it's nice to come into a warm church, but you came because you cared. There was something in you that said, all right, there might be something I could get out of this. So I want to leave time for us to think about, where do I go when I leave this door? What do I think about? Maybe it starts with, I'm not sure that I can go move to a different community that's more diverse, or maybe I don't really know how it's going to impact my work life, but I'm going to think about the next podcast that I listen to, or the next documentary that I watch, the authors that I read. I'm going to look for Christian scholars who are people of color who can have something to say about some of these issues, the intersections of these issues. I'm not just going to ignore that as that's somebody else's agenda, but I'm going to say, no, this was front and center, to Christ. This is what Jesus cared about, amongst many other things. He validated differences. There were so many opportunities and times in the gospel where, marriages and relationships across color lines were made to show that that's a beautiful thing, right? But yet our churches sometimes are telling us otherwise. I asked my students, how many of you were when you learned about the curse of Ham, told that was a curse on, African descendants? And about half the class raises their hands, and I'm like, what? This is still happening, right? Nobody's told them something different. My own parents, my mom and my stepdad, so my mom remarried, my stepdad who's African American, and then they adopted 3 kids, lovely Brady Bunch family. When they were taking them to Awana at a lovely church in where we lived, they asked my parents, who are both PhD level psychologists, to come and do a marriage workshop. And so the young pastor said, but Dr. and Mrs. Ivey, or Dr. and Dr. Ivey, can you come on different nights? And they're like, well, if it's a marriage workshop, kind of nice to have the 2 people together, My mom's like me, she talks a lot. My stepdad's a little more cool, he'll quiet her down a little bit. And the pastor said, well, we don't want people to see that you're married. And she's like, is it because we're old? I don't get it. We married old, we divorced, sorry, I know that, No, we don't want people to think that the church is okay with interracial marriage. What? This was less than 15 years ago, right? Wow, scary. And these were loving people who embraced. They would hug my stepdad on Sunday morning. They'd pat him on the back. How you doing? So you think, I'm in a place where I'm seen, but I'm not really seen. I'm not really honored for who I am. Who I am is not the full who I am. You don't really want that. Right? We're okay with you being separate, but not together. Scary thought, right? But so that might seem extreme, but what are the ways that ourselves have done that maybe in different ways, right? Where we've said, I'm okay with this, if you can talk to me like I want to hear it, but don't really give me this because that's too much for me to handle. right? We've got to push ourselves. I tell my students all the time, you got to get comfortable with discomfort, right? You should walk out of college, out of church, out of time together, challenged and uncomfortable in a good way, like, ooh, wow. And I tell my students, when you feel something, say, ouch. Like, ooh, that got to me. But you should feel that way. Otherwise, if you're not doing that, it's stagnation. It's status quo. It's what I've always done, where I've always lived, who I've always talked to, the restaurants I've always gone to, the movies I've always watched, right? We're not growing. That's not what Jesus desires for us. He wants us to grow. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter where you grew up in terms of, it matters, but I mean, it's not an excuse to say, well, because I grew up that way, great. So if you grew up and you didn't have that, that's all the more reason to lean in and cultivate that for yourself now. Never too late. Right? So I think it's important that we think about how many times are we uncomfortable for the gospel, number one, right, where we put ourselves out there for Jesus, but also uncomfortable in our quest for justice, right, where we're learning how other people are uncomfortable maybe on a daily basis because of their race. How many times am I hearing those stories? Maybe we're hearing about how somebody who speaks two languages but speaks with an accent is made to feel different when they go out in public and try to order deli meat at Publix. Can you speak slow? I've seen this happen, not at Publix here, but in Florida. Yelling at somebody with an accent. Can you speak slower, please? What? They're just ordering boar's head turkey. Like, come on, it's not that hard, you know. But these ways that your language is invalidated because speak to me like I want to hear it, right? Give it to me like I give it to you. We don't need to be that way. Can you imagine the accents and the ways of dialect that were in the Bible? A huge array. It wasn't English. It wasn't the Queen's English. It wasn't, right? I'll never forget when I was in social work school, and it was a bunch of social workers. You'd think the most empathetic people in New York City, diverse group, and the speaker, this esteemed speaker, was Colombiana and had a thick accent. I understood him perfectly, no problem. And they were so rude. They were whispering and like turning their backs and like, oh, I don't even, they just didn't. And I thought, this is awful. Here is a group of people who are supposed to be charged with empathy, right? Who this is their daily work, and they're awful, and they're totally, denigrating and disregarding this person. How many times have we done that, right? The church is supposed to be the leader, like have the home run on empathy, on Christ-like humility, on validating stories, on listening to people's truths and understanding their reality. How many times have we, I don't want to hear that. That's not, you're just making that up. That's not true. That didn't really happen. They must not have meant that. Let's stop doing that, right? It's invalidating people's experiences. It creates silence then. Because why am I going to want to tell you that I experienced racism or other forms of injustice if you're going to tell me it's not true? I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to isolate myself. And then I don't feel like the church is really there for me. I don't feel like my body of believers, my friends, are really my friends because they're not hearing my whole story. They say they care, but they're not really listening. So it's a challenge, myself included, to the times when maybe I've thought, come on, it couldn't really be that. It must have been something else, right? We wouldn't, again, think about what would we feel like if we just shared a vulnerable truth with somebody about something deep and horrific that happened to us, and somebody was like, I think on a scale of 1 to 10, you're telling me about a 4. No, it's a 10 for me, and you better hear it like a 10. Right? We want to give the person that feeling, that what they shared, thank you for sharing it. I honor your experience. I'm so sorry that happened. Help me understand more. I might not understand. This is so new to me, this whole understanding, but I'm reading and I'm listening, and now I'm in relationship with people. So that's really the next steps for us in 3 minutes of thinking about, instead of being colorblind, how do I become more color conscious or color brave? Now, I did not coin the term color brave. There's a great TED Talk called Color Brave, done by a wonderful woman who does a lot of diversity training in the business world, so she kind of comes at it from that lens. But thinking about, instead of erasing or minimizing differences or different experiences, we look to be color conscious, to be aware, right? We recognize and celebrate differences. We don't see them as deficits, right? We see them as strengths. How often are we seeking out community with other believers who look differently, speak different languages, represent a different social class. And again, not just like a Christmas thing, like a once a year, shake hands, go home. That's great. But I challenge us to think about deeper relationship, because when we want to, and Jeanette and I were talking about this too, sometimes the burden that people of color bear because they're always the ones that have to hear the questions and the stories. And that can be exhausting for people sometimes when you're, it's like, or put in another person thing, if you don't want to talk about race, somebody with a disability, somebody's always asking them questions like, what is it like to do? Sometimes you're like, yeah, I want to talk, I'm ready for it, I'm good. But then other times you're like, just do some work, Google it. Like, look up a quote, like do something, do a little bit of work beforehand, and then come back and ask me when you've gotten a little more informed, right? But if we're in community with people, then we're calling up our good friend, like, you know what, I might have done an ouch today. I said something in the workroom that I realized probably wasn't. What do you think about that? Right? It's more relational. We're not just going to like the one black person in our child's school or something else and saying like, hey, can you tell me about fill in the blank, or the person with a disability that's gotten 7,000 questions before yours. We're like, no, this is somebody I'm in relationship with. So in relationship, we're going to talk about all sorts of things. And they might ask me questions about my identity, right? It becomes it's a reciprocal thing. We're leaning and gleaning off of each other. But again, that only comes from true community. You all know that. That's a hallmark of this church, where people are really intentional about deep relationships. So how do we bring that to those outside of the church, right? If the church doesn't represent all of the beautiful diversity of the world. I always tell my kids, it's like, think about a large farmhouse table with all the dining room chairs, and I say, who's missing at our table, right? Who's missing at our table? Who are we missing? Whose voices, whose perspectives are missing from our table, right? You can imagine that this is me all the time. My kids hear it all the time, so they're like, well, nobody's missing, Mom, because we've talked about everyone. Good, right? But not everybody. We have a long way to go, too. But, right, who's missing? So if you can't bring it in your life right now, what kind of books are you bringing home for your kids? And I encourage you to do some deep looking, right? Don't just bring books that represent only historical, like, hard things, right? Those are good, right? But we don't want our kids to just see Native Americans, let's say, in one way of history. Because then they're like, are there Native Americans alive today? Yes, they are, and they're still experiencing injustice. But it's not just back then, right? So we want to make sure that our representation of books is diverse also in narrative. It's a complex story, right? That also shows our kids, you can look like this and do this. You can look like this and be from here, right? Not just a singular narrative. I encourage you to watch another TED Talk. I'm giving you all these great resources. The Danger of a Single Story. Anybody watch that one? Awesome. It'll change your life. So good. Got to hear her speak at Vanderbilt, the author of a book and this TED Talk. But she talks about that single narrative, right? She's an African woman, a Nigerian woman, and how it's been detrimental for her. We are at 7:30, so I am going to, let me see, the last point on this slide, and this is something, the second to last point, that my pastor says all the time. It's the slogan of our church. God wants us to be one, but not the same. One, but not the same, right? So he wants us to be united, but in that united family, to be able to look around and say, my life is better because of the language that you speak, and the hue of your skin, and the texture of your hair, and the color of your eyes. That makes my life better. Not, I want to blend it so that it looks like me. I want you to keep all of those parts of who you are, because that makes God's family this beautiful place. Right? So I'm going to end there. I want you to think about and commit in your head or on paper, what's something that you can be intentional about maybe this week, maybe next month, 6 months from now. Like, set some goals, right? Because otherwise, it's just a lot of information that came at you quick, and you're like, all right, let me out of this place, lady. I want you to think about, where am I going, right? What do you think I can really do in a week? What can I do longer out? So think about that and challenge yourself, and ask other people to hold you accountable. Hey, check up on me in 6 months to see if I did what I said I was going to do. And if I didn't, that's okay, but what is my plan to do it in the next 6 months, right? Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. You were awesome. Thank you.
All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to enter into some questions that you've been sending us. It's not too late to send us questions. The numbers are right up here, to our left, to our right, and they will send Jeanette. Let me also introduce my life partner, Jeanette Wolf-Leggett. Jeanette is the executive admin for the headmaster at St. Paul in Green Hills. She's also the CEO and CFO of a multi-member household and runs it like a Fortune 500 company. And I am nothing without my life partner, Jeanette. So Jeanette, thank you for being here. And we've all sat on bleachers together over at Hunter's Bend with our kids. So this will be fun. So text your questions. She'll get questions. I'll get questions. I want to start off with this one. You could ask me any question about theology, God, life, death, hell, resurrection, and I would feel comfortable and really not that nervous giving it a shot. Starting these questions and entering into this dialogue, I can get paralyzed with fear.
Sure.
And I think many of you may experience this as well. We get paralyzed with fear. I do not want to say something stupid.
Right.
I don't have the vocabulary to enter into these conversations. As a matter of fact, they change. And a word can become racist overnight, or maybe it was always racist, but I don't know.
Right.
So how do we even enter into these kind of conversations by letting guards down, by being willing to fail without offending and hurting and insulting?
Sure. Here's the thing. Most of the people that I know that are people of color who have experienced a lot of injustices that we discussed tonight, most of them are super open to building relationships across differences. I mean, they have to, right? Their workplaces are not people that look like them, right? So they have to do that naturally. And so, obviously, within humanity, there's no monolithic statement to be said about any racial or ethnic group. That's important, including, white people, black. There's not like one way to say all of this group are going to react to you this way. Some people have different kinds of personalities, so you're like, I might not want to ask that person. They're just not real friendly. But find, again, in relationship, building community, and preface your questions. And I've never had somebody who's been a relational person that has had somebody who comes at them with a humble stance been like, I can't even listen to your question, you're offensive. I've not had that happen, right? Okay. So if you come at it like, you know what, I am just beginning this journey of awakening and I'm learning, and so I may ask this question in a really strange way and help me so that I don't say the wrong thing, but here's what I want to know. That's a humble stance. Most people aren't going to be like, go somewhere else, right? They're going to say, all right, you know what, but don't say this when you're asking that, or don't do this, but here, let's get to the meat of your question, right? So for example, I have had students that have used the term colored in class or oriental. We don't use those terms. They're offensive and they're wrong, but they don't know. And so they've said them, and I see some of my other students looking at me like, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I'm not going to embarrass them, because they were actually participating in class. That's great. So they're actually trying, right? And so I would catch them after and say, hey, you know what? I know you were coming into this and you were trying to, I could see that the wheels were turning, you're thoughtful. That's not a term we use anymore. Next time say people of color, or if you're trying to specify a particular group, just say that group. Oh, okay, right? And oriental, that's a rug, that's not a people group, right? That's an offensive term used against Asians. We don't say that. So, okay, so specify. If you're talking about Chinese people, if you're talking about Korean, or if you're talking about Asians in general, which again, probably not good to talk about whole continents of people because there's a whole lot of diversity, but anyway, so it's trying to do it that way, being open on the other side, right? I'm not going to publicly scold or shame them, because they're coming from a place of they're just underexposed. That's a term I use a lot, underexposed, right? And so how do I build that exposure? That's a real gracious term.
That's a very gracious term. That's a very gracious term.
I thought you said racist. I was like, oh,
no.
I'm sorry.
No, it's such a gracious term, yes. Underexposed.
Let me tell you something I learned the other day, and this blew my mind. I have a friend who is parenting, her and her husband are white, they're parenting kids at the intersection of race and disability. She has a black son who has autism, and he's a big boy, and she's so scared for him because of some of the things that have happened to kids with disabilities in schools across the color lines, but especially for black kids. And she posted something after, because we're at the 100-day thing, and I didn't even think about this. She posted something that said, think about that the way that we often can dress our kids with canes and with hair. we're kind of poking fun at older folks, and we're also letting kids kind of practice using a cane for fun when there's people who fundamentally need this to get around. Now she's passionate about this because that's, her son and her family, but I thought, I've never even thought about that. So all of us can learn, and you may not take that, and that might not be something that transforms your world, but it was interesting to think about. There's all these things that we might not think about if we're not at the intersections of these conversations. And so I was glad to at least say, that's something. Now, it's great, put on the 100 days, shirts and all those things. She wasn't getting on that. It was more the use of the cane and kind of almost like kids will look like, oh, I'm trying to be old, when people are really struggling in that life space. So anyway, the point is we're all learning, right? We all have a lot to learn, even if feel like we know things in one particular area. So we can see it as a point of humility. Now, so I could have looked at that and been like, why is she making that a big deal? Well, that's something that is a big deal for her, because her son goes through the world very differently. And she's thinking about how he may need to rely on that someday. So I have to hear her truth and say, that's something that's important to her, and learn from it. So I think a posture of humility goes so far, right? Most people, like I said, they're not going to scold us or come down on us if we're approaching things with a real heart to learn. But at the same time, we're also doing our own work, right? So we're also learning. Hey, I read this podcast, or I listened to this podcast, or read this author. Wow, I'm impressed that you are doing that work. You're letting other voices influence your thinking and shape your ideas about this. Now you're asking questions, but you're coming from a more informed place, right? So it's both and. It's not just relying on the one person who represents that particular group to tell you everything. That's okay to get some information if you're in a relationship, but also do some of that work too.
All right, Jeanette, you're up.
Okay, Mona. You mentioned movies and books and podcasts and whatnot, which is probably a really great way, a really great way to enter into conversation, to have those conversations in more of an open way. It's easier to talk about somebody else sometimes first before you talk about yourself. So somebody said, 13th, a great movie, please say more about its value to helping privileged white people understand the system in places that suppress.
So what I love about that movie is that it really takes us back into history that's not that far away. Again, if we think about that timeline, but it connects the dots, right? So the whole premise of the film is that the 13th Amendment, the amendment to abolish slavery, was never abolished because it was just reformulated into basically this hyper-incarceration of black males who then, when they come out of prison, and people who are in prison in general, but there's an representation of black males in prison. There's other groups in prison too, but when they come out of prison, they're not allowed to vote, they're not allowed to gain access to society, so you're enslaving them in different ways, right? And so that's the premise of the film, but looking at history, right? Looking at films that maybe some of our parents watched as kids that shaped the psyche around fear of, in this film particularly around African Americans, but shaped the psyche of fear and distrust. Where did that come from? So if we find ourselves having a reaction now, like, oh, I'm in the mall and I see a tall black man, I'm going to grab my purse. Where does that come from? Part of being color brave and color conscious is saying, I'm not going to suppress that thought. I'm going to think about where is that coming from. My pastor, who's a black man, says when he gets into elevators with people, he immediately starts cracking jokes because he doesn't want them to be afraid of him, right? So he immediately will start he's got to put on a whole persona. Now, he's a funny, fun guy. That's probably what he does in general. But it's like, shift into gear, right? That's a lot to carry all the time. So the film really weaves together how that history and how that sort of legal and legislative law that we thought, took care of this thing really didn't. It just morphed. And how it's morphed even then from not only just hyper-incarceration, but the way it sort of presents itself into a lot of the systems. I mentioned that systemic thing. So keep an open mind when you watch it. I know sometimes I'll be interested to see what my students say tomorrow, because some of them totally disagree with it. They're like, it's propaganda. I'm like, okay, so help me understand where you're coming from then. Bring me some facts on the other side then, right? But keep an open mind when you watch things, right? She's a strong black woman who made it, so she does have her feelings about it. But look at the history. We can't deny the history. And we can't see the present disconnected from the history, right?
So we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Here's a thoughtful question. Dr. King said that the most segregated hour of the week is Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that's because of racial differences or cultural differences within the races?
That's a heavy hitter. Well, I think that because our neighborhoods, our schools, our life in general is hyper-segregated, right? Not many of us in this region live in well-integrated places, right? Our schools are not well-integrated. And so as a result of that, we end up socializing with the people around us, which is not our fault, but then that manifests itself on Sunday mornings. Because what neuroscience tells us is that our brains are attracted to what we're used to, what we're comfortable with, and if we're used to and comfortable with white people, if we're white, then that's what we're going to find. I'm not saying that everybody should, leave this church and go join a multi-ethnic church, but I do think that if you're not going to get it at home, if you're not going to get it at school, and you're not going to get it at church, which are the 3 institutions where we spend the majority of our time and work, then we ought to find other places to get it in a meaningful way. I don't think that it's cultural differences in terms of like worship style, those kind of things. Yeah, I think that's part of it, but our church blends all sorts of things. So we'll do like old-fashioned hymns, and then we'll do gospel, and it's, pastors, you're not going to make everybody happy on a Sunday morning no matter what you play. So integrate a little more. I mean, I think about, and I don't want to get off too far on this, but it frustrates me on some of the Christian radio stations that they're not playing any gospel, right? I mean, I love gospel. Like, why are we not playing? Why is that not integrated? Like, that's a very easy way to just expose people to music that is soulful, that's often deeply emotional in a way that's not just about praise, praise, praise. That's great. We do praise and adore the Lord, but we also suffer. And and lament. And why are we not blending that on the radio? Like, that seems like a pretty easy outlet, but we don't. And I don't know. So if we can't even do it there, where it's like it's on the radio, it's disconnected, right? We're not even seeing the people doing it. It's going to be hard to do it on Sunday mornings. But I encourage you. Maybe you don't attend a multiracial church during the week, but like our church, for example, we have kids that can come to Awana at our church if you don't go to our church. So that's a great way. And of course, I mean, VBS is just kind of one week thing. But get your kids into something where they're going to be around other kids, right? And that's a great way to begin to do it. Or how many of y'all are familiar, for women, we have these wonderful Be the Bridge groups across Nashville? Nobody knows about Be the Bridge? Some of you, yay. So Be the Bridge are great ways, look it up online, to get together with, it's a multi-ethnic, multiracial group, it's faith, it's Christian. We're journeying together through this great curriculum. It's a national program. So there are these outlets that even if we want the comfort of our neighborhood church, which is okay, we also can find these other ways to connect on a spiritual level with brothers and sisters in Christ across differences.
Great. Thank you for letting us be on our phone while we talk to you so we could find questions.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Okay, so lastly, we want to invite you back. We want to keep this conversation going, of course. We want to invite you back April 29th. Trillia Newbell has a new book, Unity, Captured or Captivated by God's Vision of Diversity. She's going to be here to speak with us that night and continue this conversation. But also, Dr. Soto is going to be teaching a class in the fall for us here. Will you tell us about that class?
Yes, so myself and my husband and a few of us at Strong Tower had the pleasure of developing a 12 or 14-week class called God's Diverse Kingdom, Race, Class, and Gender in the Bible. And so we go deep, right? We really kind of pull apart really interesting historical topics, current issues. We look at Scripture every week. We look at how those things intersect with the Word of God. And we keep it real for people. It's definitely an uncomfortable but growing space. It's wonderful. And we really get to know each other in a very deep way because we hear people's stories. And oftentimes in the larger body, we don't get to necessarily hear those same levels of stories, but in smaller classes, we get to do that. So we put a lot of privilege and time on the essence of storytelling and using that as a medium to really think about these things. It can disarm some of our discomforts too if we hear stories. So a lot of time, I mean, we have the benefit of having a lot of that diversity at Strong Tower to hear stories, but if we don't have that, then we can bring them in through children's books or through other things to tell us, right? So I intend to carry it out that way here in terms of bringing in lots of those different voices, letting us read together and come back and journey together and ask hard questions, and I'm excited.
It's going to be a class you do not want to miss. It should be pretty dynamic.
Yes.
Hey, thank you so much for being here.
It's great.
Can we thank her corporately?
I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for showing up. It says a whole lot about you for being here. And now it's 7:49. We want to just give you the space to continue the conversation. Dr. Soto will be here if you want to ask her some questions. Please don't dominate her. So have some self-awareness for
I've got business cards. We can
a
talk
60-second
longer.
question or so. And feel free to step in and listen to the questions that the other person is asking. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all so much. This is such a warm, it gives me such joy to look out to smiling faces. I have had people turn their backs on me at trainings. It's not very fun. It's all right though, because you all made up for that. There was so much warmth in the room, so I really appreciate you guys. It was a wonderful group to speak to, so thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. What's that? She is very smart, and you can say she's super cute. It's inappropriate for me to say that. Are you talking about Jeanette? She's so
yes,
cute.
She is. Both
Hey,
of the
y'all,
women on the
eat some
stage.
cookies and drink some coffee.